Hello, and welcome to the third and final part of the Landscape Speaks. My name is Mave Calvert, and I am a member of the British Society of Dowsers. I'm also known as Mave Marian, the Sherwood Dowser, and that's because I live on the outskirts of the ancient and mysterious forest of Sherwood in the English Midlands, famous for its legends of Robin Hood, Maid Marian, and the Merry Men. In the first part of the Landscape Speaks, I talked about lots of pentagrams I've found in the landscape. And in the second part, I talked about places where it appears that multiple alignments cross. And now, in part 3, we're going to talk about some of the dowsing experiments that I've done to find out if there is any energy associated with these landscape geometries. So follow me down the rabbit hole into a wonderland of energy, water, trees, and elementals in the landscape. In part 1, I mentioned a landscape pentagram on the Mediterranean island of Malta. I visited there in 2017. Before I went, I mapped out on Google Earth exactly where I thought the 5 tips of the pentagram were located, the intention being to visit each one and dowse any energy features that may be present. My partner Gav and I hired a car and spent a full day travelling round Malta to locate the 5 pentagram tips. The first tip was the northeastern one, situated at a place called Baha Kaha, and my dowsing suggested that it would be down a trackway just off the main road leading down the cliffs. We found that the trackway was blocked off by large boulders, so Gav stayed with the hire car, much bemused at my antics scrabbling down the cliff top, trying to locate invisible energies. My dowsing took me to a large boulder, and I found that it was situated in a spiral energy vortex. Emerging from the centre of this vortex was a pillar of light or electromagnetic radiance, and that rose up to a metre above the ground, just above the top of the boulder. Coming out from this were 4 lines of energy, which went horizontally at 1 metre above ground level, and it appeared that they were each going in the direction of one of the other pentagram tips. Our next port of call was to find the eastern tip of the pentagram, which I had dowsed as being in a suburb of Paula, not far from the ancient Tarsian temples. And here I found another spiral, in which a young tree was going. 1 metre up the trunk there radiated 4 lines of energy, and they appeared to be going in the direction of the other 4 pentagram tips. We then drove to the southern point of the landscape pentagram, which was situated at the ancient temple of Hagarim, which is only 500 metres from its sister temple of Manijra, and the two have a large visitor centre with a cafe where you can park bored husbands. So leaving Gav there, I went in search of the next tip of the pentagram. I didn't find it at the temple itself, however. It was on a cliff-top bluff, and here I dowsed a small earth energy vortex spiral, in which was sighted a telescope, and radiating from the stem of the telescope at 1 metre above ground level were 5 lines of energy. 4 of them seemed to be going in the directions of the other pentagram tips, whilst a 5th went out to sea, heading for a small island. After partaking of the local delights in the cafe at the visitor centre, we continued our journey along the Dingley Cliffs, which rise high above the Mediterranean Ocean. And along there we found the southwestern tip of the pentagram. It was located right on the edge of the cliff, overlooking a small plateau. This time I dowsed an earth energy spiral at ground level, but there was no physical matter such as a boulder, a tree, or even a telescope situated in it. I dowsed devicelessly, and I can feel the electromagnetic energy with my hands, and I could feel a vertical column of energy rising from the centre of the spiral to a height of 1 metre above ground level. At that point, it split into 4 lines of energy which radiated away, travelling at 1 metre above ground level in the direction of the other 4 pentagram tips. The final tip of the landscape pentagram in the northwest was located at the ancient temple of Scorba. Just like at the northern tip of the pentagram, I found that there was a boulder sited in an earth energy vortex. And again, coming up through that earth energy vortex was a vertical pillar of light, which at 1 metre above ground split into 4, and radiating from the boulder were 4 lines of energy which went away horizontally 1 metre above ground level in the direction of the other 4 pentagram tips. In 2023, the British Society of Dowsers published an article in their journal Dowsing Today about my adventures dowsing the tips of the Maltese pentagram back in 2017. So what are these energy features that I keep dowsing at the tips of landscape pentagrams? I've been working with and researching earth energy vortices since 2006, and I dowse them devicelessly, with my hands being able to feel the electromagnetic radiance. And this form of dowsing also allows me to dowse them in 3D. Simply, there's a column of energy rising vertically from the ground, and this consists of a central cube of light or electromagnetic radiance, which is about 2 or 3 centimeters in diameter. And this is surrounded by 2 spirals of opposing polarity, shown as red and blue here. One dowses clockwise, one dowses anti-clockwise. One rises up as the other goes down. And if you were to view this from above, it would look very much like a spiraled galaxy, with a dot in the middle representing the central tube of light, and the red and blue spirals representing the spirals that radiate from this. And it all feels like it is contained within a plasma tube. And what are these lines of energy that radiate from the tips of the pentagrams? Put simply, they are exactly the same thing, but instead of rising up vertically from the ground, they run horizontally, with the core being at exactly 1 metre above ground level. The core is the same tube of electromagnetic radiance or light that is around 2 or 3 centimeters in diameter, and again you get the 2 spirals of opposing polarity. So what exactly happens at the tips of the pentagrams? What you have is the vertically rising energy reaching 1 metre above ground level. And at this point, it not only changes direction by 90 degrees, but it splits into 1 or more lines of energy. And this reminds me of the prism effect, When white light is shone into a prism, it is refracted into all the colours of the spectrum, and at the same time that light is bent. If physical matter, such as a boulder, a tree, or even a telescope, is placed in an earth energy vortex, the energies will rise up around that physical matter. Earth energy vortices also have a chakra system, just like you or I. And if you step into an earth energy vortex that doesn't have any physical matter in it, and just sensitive enough, you will actually feel the energy rising up around you and connecting with your own chakra system. And this is what happens when a standing stone is in an earth energy vortex. According to Rosicrucian spiritual science, the chakras anchor the etheric body to the physical body, and this is exactly what happens with a standing stone. The chakra system of the vortex anchors itself to the physical matter of the standing stone, and together they amplify each other's energies. Dowsers such as Tom Graves and Maria Wheatley show how standing stones have different coloured bands on them corresponding to the chakras, and this is exactly what happens when the standing stone is placed in an earth energy vortex. Some of these earth energy vortices have been created by the action of mature trees. When a mature tree sends down its taproot looking for underground water and locates that water, it starts sucking the water upwards into the tree itself. All moving water creates an electromagnetic current, and this becomes the earth energy vortex, which can be dowsed at ground level as the spiral. The energies, then, as we have seen, will rise up to encompass the tree, and the energy of the tree and the energy of the vortex will amplify one another. When the tree has been felled or died and no longer exists, the earth energy vortex that it created often remains and can be dowsed at ground level as a spiral. Mature trees give out lines of energy to neighbouring trees that they have lines of sight to. These lines of energy are straight, and when I douse them with my hands, they feel like they are 5 centimetres in diameter, just like the tubes at the centre of earth energy vortices and the lines of energy that come out of the landscape pentagram tips. I often do experiments with earth energies by playing Tim Wheater's Gayatri mantra to them. And I was in Hucknall churchyard one day, not far from the southwest tip of the Sherwood Forest pentagram. And I had located some of these lines of energy connecting trees. And when I played my Tim Wheater music, the lines of energy widened out from 5 centimetres in diameter to a metre, and dowsing them with my hands, I could tell that this was because the two spirals of opposing polarity had appeared, as if a switch had been flipped and the tree had been turned on or energized. And I found this also happened when I wasn't playing Tim Wheater music, but a service was going on in the church. However, at this time, the line of energy only widened out from 5 centimetres to 50 centimetres in diameter. The two spirals still appeared, but didn't seem to be quite as powerful. As I mentioned in part 1, during the COVID lockdown, the dowsing groups took to Zoom. The Earth Energy Zoom group was formed, and we were introduced to the concept of a beacon tree, which is a tree that has very special energies, and was first brought to the attention of the dowsing community by the artist tree dowser Gordon Field. A beacon tree is essentially like a mobile phone mast, broadcasting energy over a radius of 1 to 2 miles. Its energy extends high up into the atmosphere and deep down into the earth, where it touches the water that is created by the earth herself, known as primary water to the dowsers. A beacon tree is also associated with a beacon spring, which also brings primary water to the surface. And this is the same as the structured water, which is very healing and talked about by Dr. Gerald Pollack and Veda Austin, and it often forms a sacred spring in the countryside or a holy well in the churchyard. Sometimes beacon trees were felled in order for a church to be built, and quite often you will find that the church spire is exactly above where the beacon tree was, and still has the beacon tree energies. Indeed, many churches probably contain wood from the beacon tree that was felled in order to energize the church. In some cases where there are no trees, there might be a sacred site, such as a stone circle, and one of the stones there is likely to be in beacon tree energies. The British Glossary of Dowsing Terms defines primary water as being formed inside the earth, as opposed to surface water that is formed in the atmosphere, such as rain or snow. The primary water theory says that steam, formed under great pressure deep in the earth, is forced upwards, condensing as it gets closer to the surface. This occurs in deep faults and fractures, where vertical blind springs or domes are formed. In places where primary water is found, the dowsable energy will be predominantly yin or negative in nature. The same glossary defines a blind spring as a vertical shaft of ascending water that does not rise to the surface of the earth, but disperses through several horizontal fissures, which can be at various depths. Dowsers identify blind springs as several underground streams radiating from a central point, and some of these may subdivide into smaller streams. Blind springs are found at many ancient sites and churches, but they're also to be found elsewhere in the countryside. Now, I term this a blind spring network, where the blind spring in the centre can be dowsed with what is known as a geospiral pattern above it. And this is a very large spiral, and the energies radiate out a bit like a fountain or ripples on a pond. However, dotted around the blind spring are a network of these smaller earth energy vortices that I've been talking about in association with the pentagram tips. And these are the ones which were formed by the action of mature trees, some of which may no longer be present. So here we have a blind spring network, with the blind spring in the center and the geospiral pattern above it, and then the smaller vortices or spirals dotted here and there. We then add in the trees, many of which stand in the smaller vortices which they themselves have created. Then there will be a beacon tree at some place within the network, and also a spring. This spring may still rise to the surface, or it may not. Now we add in the lines that the trees give out to one another and the beacon trees, and we have a beacon tree network superimposed upon a blind spring network, and my dowsing suggests that the two work in tandem. In part 1, I mentioned the Sherwood Forest pentagram, the first landscape pentagram that I'd ever found. And I mentioned that when I visited each of the tips, the tip turned out to be at a mature tree. And also, right in the centre of that pentagram is another very mature tree, the major oak in Sherwood Forest. This is Southwellminster, located at the southeast tip of the Sherwood Forest pentagram, and its grounds are full of mature trees. The tip of the pentagram is situated at a chestnut tree, from which radiate 4 lines of energy going in the directions of the other tips of the Sherwood pentagram. The beacon tree is situated elsewhere in the grounds, and in this case is a mature sycamore, although dowsing suggests that there have been many generations of beacon trees on this exact spot, and previously they've been oak trees. Radiating from the trunk of the beacon tree at 1 metre above ground level are lots of lines of energy that connect with the other mature trees in the grounds. And there's also one line connecting the beacon tree with the chestnut tree that is the tip of the pentagram. This is the beacon tree network at Southwellminster seen from above. One of the lines that radiates from the beacon tree connects with a very large column of stone inside the minster, and that douses as having once had a mature tree situated in it. Another of the lines connects with a yew tree at the far side of the minster, and it passes through what was once a holy well. That's now been covered in because in the 1700s a drunken clergyman apparently fell in it and drowned. However, this holy well is likely to be the beacon spring that was associated with the beacon tree at Southwellminster. And of course, this is also a blind spring network. For many years, I have been investigating the effect of solar transition periods on Earth energies. A solar transition period is the 20-minute period preceding the exact time of sunrise, local solar noon, sunset, new moon, half moon, and full moon. There are many changes that take place during this period, and they all seem to involve the beacon tree networks and their associated blind spring networks. The first thing that happens is there is a reversal of polarities. So anything that dowses as clockwise dowses as anti-clockwise, directions of flow reverse, and things that dowse as going up now dowse as going downwards. The lines of energy connecting the trees then suddenly become energized and widen out, in the same way as I described at Hucknall Churchyard. The trees have been taking in cosmic and telluric energy during the day, and also energy from the minerals deep in the ground, and they've been weaving this together and storing it. During the solar transition period, the vortices that the trees are standing in and the vortices that used to have trees standing in them all spin very, very fast and release their stored energy into the lines that connect them to the beacon trees. Following this, the toroidal energy form around the beacon tree starts to spin very, very fast, and this is what broadcasts the energy into the surrounding landscape. Following this, all the Earth energy vortices and the lines seem to sink underground, and I can't douse them for a period of around 3 minutes. Suddenly they all spring back and I can douse them again, and the polarities have reversed back to what they were prior to the solar transition period, and the energy lines are no longer energized and have reverted to their previous widths. And then the solar event of sunrise, solar noon, sunset, new moon, half moon, or full moon reaches its peak. In 2015, Gav and I spent a week at a cottage owned by a friend in Dumfries and Galloway, and it's very close to Tor House Stone Circle. So much to Gav's dismay, I decided to visit that stone circle as much as I could during that week to douse the energies there. The first thing that I noted was that the stones around the periphery all have a straight line of energy connecting them to their neighbour, just as I was to realise many years later that trees send out straight lines of energy to their neighbours. However, in this case, the line of energy didn't always go at 1 metre above ground level, but it emanated from and connected with angles in the stone at whatever height these happened to be. I also noted lines of energy connecting the stones on the periphery with the stone in the centre, but only where they had a line of sight to that stone. I visited during several solar noon transition periods and noted that the stone marked as stone R on the plan turned out to be the communicator that initiated and finished the solar transition period. And this stone is highly likely to be where a beacon tree once stood, as it had the exact same energies as a beacon tree. And the stone circle was part of a blind spring network. And another thing that happens during a solar transition period is that the blind spring networks take us a lot of the energy down to the primary water below ground, which then serves to cleanse all the energy in the various energy lines and vortices. So at the beginning of the solar transition period, exactly 20 minutes before local solar noon, the communicator stone sent up a sphere of energy, just as beacon trees and church spires that act as beacons do. And this sphere of energy started to spin anti-clockwise very, very fast, and it turned into a torus. A few months prior to my visit to Tor House Stone Circle, I had attended my first British Society of Dowsers Spring Symposium, and there I had purchased a book called Beyond the Far Horizon, Why Earth Energy Dowsing Works, and that was all about the life and work of the dowser from Northern Ireland, Billy Gorn. And in the book, Billy had talked about lots of dowsing experiments that he had done to find out about earth energies. And one of them gave me the idea to look for the energy torus above the communicating stone, beacon tree, or church spire. The book is compiled and narrated by Nigel Twyn and is still available from Penwith Press. And it gave me lots of ideas to do lots of experiments of my own, including trying to simulate the energy of stone circles by laying out cobbles on my lawn. I laid out lots of different configurations of cobbles, hoping that Gav wouldn't run them over with the lawnmower. The one that I found the most fascinating was a circle of 5 cobbles. I found that during the night, after sunset and before sunrise, the cobbles gave out straight line of energy to their neighbours on the periphery, just like a Tor House circle. But after sunrise, these lines disappeared, and instead each cobble gave out two lines of energy to the ones at the opposite side of the circle, and this formed a five-pointed star, which reminded me of all the landscape pentagrams that I kept uncovering. I decided to find out what would happen to this configuration of cobbles during the solar noon solar transition period. At the start, as I mentioned, there is a polarity reversal, and everything suddenly douses the opposite way around. And when this polarity reversal took place, the five-pointed star that I was dowsing during the daytime was replaced by the lines of energy around the periphery that I normally dowsed during the night time. Then, at the end of the solar transition period, when I mentioned that the energies disappear and are not dowsable, this is exactly what happened. I couldn't dowse a single energy line. As I've mentioned, I like doing experiments to see what happens to Earth energies when I play Tim Wheater's Gayatri mantra. So I tried doing that during the afternoon. And what happened was a small energy vortex formed right in the centre of the five cobbles. And the five cobbles sent out lines of energy connecting to this small vortex, and the five-pointed star completely disappeared. And I realized that this small vortex was actually the center of a toroidal energy feature which was spinning around the configuration. The following day, I decided to repeat the experiment, this time taking a sixth cobble and placing it in the center to simulate the stone in the middle of storehouse stone circle. Prior to sunrise, the five cobbles on the periphery sent out straight lines to their neighbours as in the previous day's experiment. However, after the sunrise solar transition period, the five cobbles on the outside sent out straight lines to the cobble in the centre. And I think this was because the cobble in the centre had obscured their lines of sight to the cobbles opposite them, so they were unable to form the five-pointed star. Again, I dowsed the energies during the solar noon transition period, and the polarity reversal caused the lines of energy that were going to the central cobble to be replaced by the lines of energy connecting the cobbles on the periphery. And a toroidal feature formed with its central vortex right above the cobble in the centre. Towards the end of the solar transition period, as before, all the lines of energy disappeared, and so did the toroidal feature. Again, I repeated the experiment during the afternoon by playing Tim Wheater music. The configuration of cobbles before I played the Tim Wheater music was as in diagram B, with each outer cobble sending out one single line of energy to the inner cobble. And when I played the Tim Wheater music, the toroidal shape formed again, and this disappeared as soon as I stopped playing the music. I mentioned when I spoke about Torhouse Stone Circle that the lines of energy connecting the stones seem to emanate from angled points in the stones. When I was out walking one day, I picked up two pieces of magnesian limestone and happened to notice that there were tiny spirals coming out of some of the angled corners. Some of these dowsed as yin and some as yang. And I found that if I brought the two pieces together with corners that had spirals opposite each other, those spirals would unravel and become one continuous line. and if I pulled them apart far enough, the line would disappear and the two spirals would reform. On a recent crystals course with the late Robert J. Gilbert, he mentioned how crystals with terminated points have small spirals coming out of them when they're at rest. However, if you then pick one of these crystals up and start using it for healing on another human, animal, or plant, the spiral itself will disappear and a straight line of energy like a laser beam will replace it. In part 2, I mentioned several places on the landscape where it appears that multiple alignments cross. This is Malta, where I found 10 alignments appearing to cross at the Moster Dome in the centre of the island. The Moster Dome is a huge round church built to the same blueprint as the Greek Parthenon, and it's above one of Malta's many ancient megalithic temples. And the energies inside the Moster Dome are absolutely incredible. When I had drawn the 10 alignments on the map, they all seemed to cross exactly over the Moster Dome. But when I plotted them on Google Earth, the arrangement was a little bit more haphazard like this. So I decided that during our trip to Malta in 2017, I would walk around the outside of the Moster Dome and dowse for these lines of energy. So I left Gav in the cafe opposite, sampling more of the local delights, and I walked right around the perimeter. And I plotted every energy line that I found in my notebook. And when I transferred this to Google Earth, this is what I found. There were more than 20 lines of energy coming to the Moster Dome, and all the lines seem to have a direction of flow towards the church. I went back and retrieved Gab from the cafe and we went inside, where I tried to walk as near as I could to the periphery again and pick up all these lines of energy. But to my surprise, I couldn't pick up a single one of them. It appeared that all the lines of energy were actually incoming towards the dome and terminated at the masonry. All the lines of energy that I picked up around the Moster Dome were all flowing to the dome. In the same way as in my cobble experiments, the lines were flowing towards the centre during the day. I also noted that every single line that I picked up joined the masonry at 1 metre above ground level, the exact height that the straight lines connect to trees. Also, the lines of energy joined wherever there was an angled point, be it the corner of the building, the corner of a gatepost, or the corner of a statue plinth. And I was reminded of my cobble experiments where I had noted that the straight lines of energy emanated from corners of the cobbles. When I returned home from Malta and wrote up my notes, it became apparent that those alignments were not crossing at the Moster Dome at all, but were actually radiating to it. In order to find out more about this, I visited another place where I had thought that multiple alignments were crossing, and this is Annesley Old Church, which is about 2 miles from the southwestern tip of the Sherwood Forest pentagram. And here, back in 2008, I had found 21 alignments between local churches that I had assumed were crossing over at Annesley Old Church. Annesley Old Church is in ruins and it stands on a mound. Near to the remains of the tower and the nave is a large holm oak tree which dowsed as being a beacon tree, and radiating from the trunk were numerous lines of energy at 1 metre above ground level. First, I assumed, as I had done at Moster, that this was the point where the multiple alignments that I had found on the map crossed. But again, as at Moster, I found out that the direction of flow of all the lines were incoming towards the tree. I also realised that the number of lines wasn't the same as the number that I had plotted on the map, and when I got back home and put them onto Google Earth, they weren't going in the right direction for all the various surrounding churches. What I managed to dowse was that a lot of these lines of energy, just like at Southwellminster, connect to local trees and make up a beacon tree network. And this is on the same spot as there is a blind spring network. And as I've mentioned before, I believe that the two work in tandem. And I dowsed a blind spring right beneath where the altar of the church once was. To find out more about these places where multiple alignments appear to cross, I turned my attention to Micklebarrow Hill, which I mentioned in part 2. Micklebarrow Hill is the same distance from the southeast tip of the Sherwood pentagram as Annesley Old Church is from the southwest tip. Recently, I had the opportunity to go to Micklebarrow Hill with a group of local dowsers. The first thing I noticed was that when we were some distance away, that there were several lines of energy appeared to be travelling towards the hill, and these were consistent with what I'd plotted on the map as the lines coming from the various churches in the area. As we neared the hill and started climbing up it, it became obvious that these lines of energy did not converge on a single point. However, each line of energy converged at a tree on the side of the mound. Home, I decided to face the wrath of Gavin lawnmower and do some more experiments with cobbles on the lawn. So I laid out lots of cobbles to try and simulate the churches that surround Micklebarrow Hill and send out lines of energy connecting to it. I then placed a circle of 4 cobbles in the centre to simulate the trees that the churches send lines of energy to on Micklebarrow Hill. And I then placed another cobble right in the centre. And the first thing that happened was that lines of energy formed between the cobbles on the periphery and the cobbles in the first circle in the centre. And their lines of energy were between the cobbles that had lines of sight to each other. The 4 in the centre then formed straight lines of energy with the one right in the middle. And I noticed that during the daytime, all the energy in the lines was flowing towards the centre, but during the night time, all the energy flowed away from the centre. What I dowsed on the lawn seemed to be consistent with what I plotted on Google Earth. It appeared that there wasn't one single beacon tree on Micklebarrow Hill, but instead there were 4 trees that acted as beacon trees, taking the incoming energies from the churches, and then sending them on to a group of trees in the middle. It became obvious that what I had thought back in 2008 were multiple alignments crossing over Micklebarrow Hill and other such places were actually lines of energy coming from other beacon tree and blind spring networks to the side of the hill and connecting with trees. I'd often found when I had tried to draw lays between churches that sometimes they would just miss the church, and that was quite frustrating. But when I'd been to the churches on the ground, I'd found that the line actually crossed through a tree, which I later found was a beacon tree. In the cases where the line crossed through the church itself, there usually wasn't a beacon tree there, and the spire had the beacon tree energies instead. So it looks like that these alignments actually connect various beacon and blind spring networks to certain mounds in the landscape. In the summer of 2021, myself and some other dowsers read a book called The Land of the Fae by Rob Wildwood. In it, he referred to a mound called Pudding Pie Hill near Sowerby in North Yorkshire, and he called it a fairy mound. So several of us decided to pay it a visit to see what we could find out about the local fairy folklore. And there I had my first encounter with an elemental being, who appeared to be a little man about 2.5 foot tall, a bit like a gnome or a goblin. Shortly after that, I was asked by my friend Dan Green if I could use dowsing to investigate the curious case of the Wollerton gnomes. And this was where a group of children trespassing in a park near Nottingham at dusk in 1979 claimed to have witnessed several gnomes driving bubble cars. As part of this investigation, I decided to see what I could find out about gnomes. And on the website Elemental Beings, I found out that gnomes are said to be the guardians of energy centers and energy lines, and the sacred sites that are built upon these energy centers. And the job of the gnomes is to anchor the earth energy and pass it out to other elementals around. And the gnomes also activate energy lines and keep them clear for the earth energy to flow around the globe. And they're also able to pump up the energy of the lines to make them more powerful at certain times of the year. A couple of years later, I found the books The Standing Stone Speaks and Voices Out of Stone, which were co-authored by the dowser Natasha Hoffman. Natasha and her partner Hamilton had visited the standing stones at Karnak, and through a combination of dowsing and psychic ability, they had been able to read information that was encoded in the stones by the archangels at the end of the First World War. And the archangels said that the energy lines and grids around the planet were laid down by the archangels themselves a long, long time ago. And they said that each type of energy line and grid is overseen by a particular archangel and comes under the influences of a particular planet or star. The straight lines of energy that dowsers know as energy lays were said to be under the influence of the sun and the archangel Michael, whereas the earth energy dragon currents were said to be under the influence of the archangel Zadkiel and the planet Jupiter. And I found it very interesting that straight lines of energy are said to be under the influence of the sun, given how they behave during the solar transition periods, and also that they come under the influence of the Archangel Michael, given that places like Micklebarrow Hill are probably sacred mounds dedicated to the Archangel Michael. And in the Standing Stone Speak, there is a chapter about elemental beings, which seems to reinforce what I had read on the Elemental Beings website. And it says at each sacred site you will find a single gnome or goblin whose function is to anchor the light energies beamed at your planet from the sun. As an Earth energy dowser, I was absolutely fascinated by all this information, and it started to become clear that Micklebarrow Hill is one of these fairy mounds where elemental beings weave together cosmic and telluric energy beamed to it from the beacon tree networks, and that this energy is kept cleansed and energized by the blind spring networks and their connection to primary water. And the beacon trees themselves play a vital role in broadcasting the woven energy throughout the landscape. In parts 1 and 2 of the Landscape Speak, I spoke about how the Isle of Man was thought by the Earth Mysteries researcher John Michell to be the omphalos of the British Isles. And I also spoke about various landscape geometries that I had found there. It is said that sacred mountains control the energy network for miles around, and I have found sacred mountains at the centre of many of my landscape pentagrams, including the ones in Galicia and Iberia, and also at the centre of the pentagram in the Isle of Man, where Stony Mountain is one of only 2 granite outcrops on the whole island. Another sacred mountain is in the north of the island, and it's called Snaefell, being the highest on the island, and from that radiate multiple alignments. One of these alignments connects with Mount Golden, which is the northeast tip of the pentagram. Another of these alignments connects with a place right in the southwest of the Isle of Man called Mealy Hill, and this is where there is a circle of 6 double burial chambers, and between each of the pairs of burial chambers is a small stone avenue, along which radiates energy, and that goes in the direction of Southern Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, Wales, and Cornwall. The Isle of Man being one of the 7 Celtic nations. And I found out that archaeologists had done a project and found that there are over 200 round mounds on the Isle of Man. Could these be the fairy weaving mounds where the elemental beings work in tandem with the beacon and blind spring networks to generate energy and distribute it around? And is it possible that these landscape geometries play a part in distributing that energy over long distances? And now we return to Lincoln, England, where the magnificent Gothic cathedral stands high on a limestone cliff surrounding flat countryside. And I spoke about this place at length in parts 1 and 2 because it seems to be the centre of many of the landscape geometries that I have found in England. It lies on the equinox line that connects the Lincolnshire coast to Wales and further afield to Ireland, and it's also the pivot point between the terrestrial winter and summer triangles. Not only that, it is the exact centre point of the only geometrically perfect landscape pentagram that I have come across. Between 1311 and 1549, the high central tower of Lincoln Cathedral was surmounted by a huge spire, and that spire made it the tallest building in the world, higher even than the Great Pyramid at Giza. And given that Lincoln Cathedral stands on this high limestone cliff, perhaps it is one of these sacred mountains that controls the energy network for miles around. and perhaps underneath the building, somewhere in a cave in the cliff, as well as the relics of several high priestesses, as Dan Green suggests, there are elemental beings weaving together cosmic and telluric energies to weave into the network of energy lines and grids surrounding the planets. And perhaps Lincoln Cathedral's tower stands on the site of a beacon tree, giving it those necessary energies. And perhaps one of the 5 wells surrounding Lincoln Cathedral used to be a beacon spring. It's thought by some researchers that Lincoln Cathedral is a background between light and dark, but I would suggest that rather than it being a battleground, it is actually where light and dark, where yang and yin come together and are woven together into harmonious energies. And Dan Green wrote a 4th book, which was never published due to a disagreement between himself and the publisher. And perhaps he was divinely inspired to call that book Activation Point Earth. Our final port of call is southwest England, where the Earth Mysteries researcher John Michell found a huge landscape decagon associated with the perpetual choirs. At the centre of the decagon is the white-leafed oak, which until recently was a tree that stood on a mound and could well have been a beacon tree. A decagon is a 10-sided figure, and the Dowsers John Gibson Forte and Peter Watson spent many years dowsing lines of energy which came from the white-leaf oak to each of the 10 points of the landscape decagon, and also connected the 10 points on the periphery of the decagon. And John Michell pointed out that at some of the points on the periphery there used to be what was known as perpetual choirs, where monks chanted perpetually in order to enchant the land. And this would have had the same effect on the earth energies as playing Tim Wheater music would, and also as the solar transition periods do. Indeed, John Gibson Forte mentioned in his book The Interconnectedness of All Things that sometimes he and Peter would be dowsing in a churchyard when a service took place, and they would note that the energy lines widened out. In 2024, the British Society of Dowsers published an article that I had written about the lines connecting trees in their journal Dowsing Today. I entitled it The Old Straight Beacon Tree Tracks, and this was because in the 1920s a book was published entitled The Old Straight Track, and that was by Herefordshire man Alfred Watkins, who's now known as the father of the ley system. Watkins spoke about old straight tracks which could be found on maps and which had lines of sight from various significant places to other significant places, and these included hills, mounds, stone circles, churches, significant trees, springs, and holy wells. And on the front of the book there just happens to be the picture of a mound surmounted by trees. And this book was republished in the 1970s. And the foreword was written by John Michell, who discovered the white-leaf oak decagon and the significance of the perpetual choirs. Michell wrote that riding across the hills near Bredwardine in his native county, he, Watkins, pulled up his horse to look out over the landscape below. At that moment he became aware of a network of lines standing out like glowing wires all over the surface of the country. And throughout his life, Watkins privately maintained that he had perceived the existence of the ley system in a single flash. And I suggested in that article that the old straight tracks actually connected beacon and blind spring networks. And I also suggested that what Watkins had perceived on that day in June 1921, as he alighted from his horse, was actually the beacon tree network within the white-leafed oak decagon lighting up at solar noon as all the lines of energy between the trees became energized. I will probably never know whether the conclusions that I have drawn from all this research are correct, or whether I suffered a strange fate when I fell down a rabbit hole on the side of a fairy mound and ended up at a Mad Hatter's tea party with the Fay folk and imagined the whole thing. However, I've really enjoyed the journey and I've learnt an awful lot about dowsing and associated subjects whilst on that journey. And I do hope I've inspired you to go out into your local landscape and find out what it's got to say to you. And I do hope that I've inspired you to become a member of the British Society of Dowsers. As you can see, we don't only divine for water, we dowse for many different things that often turn out to be interconnected. And if you're watching this video, you've probably already realized that we have a YouTube channel. We also produce the magazine Dowsing Today, and we have symposiums and conferences over weekends where you can attend a variety of talks and workshops. And that, my dowsing, ley hunting and questing friends, concludes the Landscape Speaks.